Okay, here we're back from our brief break, and our final work session is Clark County Forestry. So please take it away.
Thank you, Chair, Council. Good morning. Jenny Coker, Deputy Director of Public Works, here today with Kevin Tyler, Lands Management Division Manager, and Hunter Decker, our Clark County Forester. It's our pleasure today to talk about the Clark County Forestry Program, and with that, I will hand it off to Kevin.
Good morning, councilors. If you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So our hope today is to provide you with a summary of the various forestry-related programs and activities that are managed by Public Works. So we'll give you a brief overview of the Land Management Division in Public Works, followed by the Legacy Lands Program and how forest conservation and stewardship fits in. We will discuss sustainable forestry and why we have such a program. Hunter will walk through the county's forest stewardship plan, including a brief history and upcoming activities. And then we will talk briefly about the forest practice permitting in the county and the designated forest lands taxation program. And if there's anything that you want to drill down on further, we can try to do that today through answering questions or come back at a later date with a future work session. So the Lands Management Division was created in Public Works in the middle of last year by combining some of the programs under the Parks and Lands Division of Public Works, so kind of separating the two. The division includes Legacy Lands, which is the program created for management of the Conservation Futures Levy, a sustainable forestry program, forest practices permitting, Clark County's noxious weed management program, including the Clark County Noxious Weed Control Board, Camp Bonneville remediation and site management, and administration of the county's railroad. And today we're going to focus our discussion on forestry related programs within the division. The county's Legacy Lands program is guided by the Natural Areas Acquisition Plan and the Legacy Lands Guidance Manual. The Natural Areas Acquisition Plan was last updated for the 2022 to 2027 planning horizon. And the list of acquisition projects is updated annually as part of the Parks Capital Plan. The program uses a watershed approach for conservation of open space, farmland, and forest land, and has helped the county and partners acquire high-value conservation land throughout the county. The Department of Natural Resources Trust Land Transfer Program has also been a significant source of conservation land for the county, and I'll talk more about that in an upcoming slide. Through adoption of the Natural Areas Acquisition Plan and Guidance Manual, the county has focused the acquisition strategy for farm, forestry, and open space conservation options by watershed sub area. This provides flexibility on an annual basis to prioritize each of the conservation options depending on available land and willing landowners. Conservation Futures and Legacy Lands is a willing buyer, willing seller program. There are 10 major watersheds in the county shown here, and some of these can be further subdivided into upper and lower sections like Upper East Fork Lewis River, Lower East Fork Lewis River. And this is a list of some of the more significant acquisitions using Conservation Futures funding through the history of the program, and I think this slide speaks for itself. So today we will highlight properties managed through the Sustainable Forest Management Program. The county owns some of these properties due to transfer from other governmental agencies. I know you're familiar with the Camp Bonneville Military Reservation and the transfer of that property from the Army to the county. Green Mountain and Spud Mountain, shown here, were acquired through the Department of Natural Resources Trust Land Transfer Program. This is a program where the state can transfer property that aren't meeting state trust land goals and objectives to local jurisdictions for the purpose of conservation and recreation. And while the main purpose of owning these lands is for conservation and recreation, with ownership comes responsibility for management. These properties have been part of the county building a sustainable forestry management program.
I have a question on this.
Yeah.
Was this, did DNR, did they initiate these transfers? Is this something we wanted? How did that work?
So Green Mountain is quite a bit before my history. Spud Mountain, I understand, was initiated by the state, and then they encouraged us to apply through the trust land transfer program. Hunter and I have been working on and off over the years with the state on different opportunities through the trust land transfer program, and it's become more of an application, almost like a grant type of application process, where you need to go and submit your information, and then it's considered by the legislature and the Board of Natural Resources annually, or probably semi-annually, as with the biennium budget.
And is there money exchanged, or is this a transfer back to,
So
is this reconveyance, or is this something
So
else?
this is mostly dealing with school land, at least in our experience, where the properties that are in the school trust, the common school trust, are maybe no longer effectively managed by the state, or the county of interest has a desire or a need for the property. And so there is essentially there's the legislature approves funding to pay back the trust for that property, so that the trust can then acquire different property to manage for the trust. And then the county doesn't pay any money in the receipt of that property. It's just a quit claim deed of the property to the county.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next slide, please. So this slide shows 3 additional properties that are part of the Sustainable Forestry Management Program. Bratton Canyon, the former Woodland Campground, was acquired from the Department of Natural Resources through the Trust Land Transfer Program back in 2011. The Lake Rosanna properties were purchased from the Department of Natural Resources in 2009. So that was not a trust land transfer, it was an acquisition. And Camp Hope is the former Camp Louisville, later Camp Juliana. It was acquired in 1936 as part of the Louisville Regional Park acquisition, leased to the Girl Scouts for a period of time, and now is leased to the Camp Hope organization, hence the name Camp Hope. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Hunter and let him talk about sustainable forestry.
Yes, good morning. I'm Hunter Decker, the Clark County Forester for Public Works. And here I'll talk about sustainable forestry and what that is. Sustainable forestry is about managing these lands so they remain healthy and productive for future generations. We're prioritizing the forest health, wildlife habitat, and recreational value in certain areas for the future. And yes, we are generating a little bit of revenue on the way to help fund these ongoing operations. And just to be clear, we're not clear cutting. We don't manage for timber production like the State Department of Natural Resources. We're really just managing for the long-term benefit of the forest itself. Next slide, please. So with sustainable forestry, the program was started back in 2011, originally at Camp Bonneville. The program's also certified through the American Tree Farm System, which is the green diamond sign you'll see sometimes driving around in rural Clark County on people's properties saying Family Tree Farm. It's also certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, the FSC. Sometimes you see that on cardboard cups or other paper products. With that, the addition of Green Mountain and Camp Hope with Lake Rosanna, Bratton Canyon. In 2017, I combined all these into one large county stewardship plan that would, alleviate some of the repetition of languages as far as our short and long-term goals, because a lot of those are the same with just the program itself on all our properties. And right now we are, doing ongoing management at Camp Bonneville and Spud Mountain. which is the property just east of that. Next slide. The cover picture of our forest stewardship plan, which you can find online. It's pretty much our playbook for the 6 forested properties. It's over 4,500 acres. Again, it sets our goals, describes the forest conditions and landscape, and provides our management prescriptions such as thinnings and what the reduction is going to be for those areas. And we'll be updating this. It's a 10-year plan, so 2027 coming up here soon, we'll be looking at doing a revision. Next slide, please. So short-term goals, we're mostly focused on thinning the overstock stands and creating more reduced wildfire risk on these properties. When they're left unmanaged for too long, when they were overplanted, they weren't naturally seeded in. These were stands that were manually planted. So the ground in a lot of Clark County there's certain site classes 1 through 5. Majority is site class 3 here. So trees don't differentiate as fast as a site class 1. So you'll see trees grow to a certain point and then kind of stagnate. You won't see larger ones outcompete others. So going through there and identifying the strongest, biggest ones and thinning around those creates a model like you see in this picture on the slide. Next slide. Here you see some more program results, some before and after pictures, prior conditions on the left and post-thinning conditions on the right of Green Mountain here. That's the power line corridor just directly in the middle of it. Next slide, please. Here's another picture of Camp Bonneville, the entrance of Plus Road at the gate going into past the airfield there at Camp Kilpack. The top picture is prior to thinning and the bottom picture is after thinning. And that's about a 30% reduction of the stand. So far next slide, thanks. And last kind of before and after of Camp Bonneville, this is a picture going over our crossover road. It's through somewhat the middle of the camp. There's some before and after of pre and post thinning. And so at Camp Bonneville, we've thinned over 1,000 acres. At Green Mountain, we've thinned 360. And this upcoming year, we're planning to thin at Spud Mountain 108 acres.
Chair,
Go ahead.
Hunter, I can appreciate what's being done in terms of thinning. And so I guess my question is, does it have some sort of negative impact on habitat? And I think you might have mentioned that early on, but so.
When we're looking at stands that were not, naturally seeded in, it's a landscape that is not good for nature. So really a lot of this is very beneficial and doesn't necessarily, degrade the wildlife habitat or anything in that nature.
Thank you.
And you'll see what we saw at Camp Bonneville, a lot of those stands were 60 to 80 years old and all the trees were the same height. They were really crowded together and the understory was just dark. So not a lot of plants or other trees and shrubs growing in the understory. And so through this, there's a temporary impact to wildlife habitat when you go out and harvest the trees. But afterwards, within a couple of years, you can hardly tell that anyone was there.
And it's kind of funny too, at Camp Bonneville, we thin an area right by the FBI range and literally the next day the elk were there looking at it, exploring. I think they like it. Yeah, and so we've improved this many acres throughout the different forest stands, and there's a before and after picture. Next slide.
I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of the budget side of things. So this slide shows you the revenues and expenses for operations at Camp Bonneville from 2013 to present. The current fund balance is sitting at just over 2.9 million. Revenues from the work at Green Mountain were actually contributed back to the general fund at council's direction at the time. The revenues from Spud Mountain will be managed under the Conservation Futures or Legacy Lands program and will help with ongoing forest management activities, master planning for site improvements, and enhancing opportunities for nature-based recreation. There's also a contribution of logs from Spud Mountain that'll go to the East Fork Reconnection Project. And then lastly, I also wanted to mention at Camp Bonneville, the expenses at Camp Bonneville have been used for thinning contracts, or what we call harvest and hauling contracts, maintenance of the property, noxious weed management, replanting and other reforestation activities, bridge replacement, and building maintenance, among other things.
You mentioned some funds were transferred back to the general fund. How much was that and when was that?
It was in the 2015 timeframe, and I'd have to look up the numbers for you, but it was a few $1 million.
Okay. Was it seen as a surplus that had been generated?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Here you can see our next steps with the timber sale layout here at Spud Mountain with the upland thinning corridors and new construction of roads, which are actually old decommissioned roads that we're rebuilding. And later we'll be looking at field breaks at Camp Bonneville, shaded field breaks. So it's not just a complete eyesore of a clear cut. There'll be substantially some larger trees that are, fire tolerant, that have a large enough spacing in between other forested trees. And then looking at other smaller timber sales around at Camp Bonneville, at those, high priority stands that need the health treatment. Next slide. So now I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about forest practice permitting, the other kind of half of my job that I do. Really, it's all under Revised Code of Washington 76.09, our Forest Practices Act. Then we have our Department of Natural Resources, the state, and they abide by the Washington Administrative Code 222, which is under the Forest Practices Board. And under that, you could see with the county map, all the dark green areas are state lands that the state manages. The other areas, that are white would be rural, and you can kind of see the urban layers for Clark County, which would fall under our Forest Practices Code 40.260.080. And then within the cities, we have a couple jurisdictions that have an urban forestry program. We have the city of Vancouver, and then as well as the city of Camas and their new urban forestry program.
So there's some federal land in there, mixed in there too?
Yeah, if you want to go back just quickly, the dark blue areas is some federal lands, which is primarily the Wildlife Refuge in Richfield, and a little bit of Gifford Pinchot over there on the east side of the county. The blue is county managed areas, the kind of lighter blue, and that really light green is the city of Camas, is city ownerships.
So up in this top corner there, is there a little federal land there? In the finger, yeah.
I don't believe so. I think that's all state land.
Okay. What I was curious about is whatever is happening at the federal level, if we had federal forest land, if that was going to impact anything in our county, but it's looking maybe not so
Very
much.
small amount, it looks like.
Yeah, if anything, it'd be the little sliver there.
Okay, great, thanks.
Then our next slide kind of gets more in depth of our jurisdiction of what I am looking at within the urban growth areas in rural Clark County are class 4 general conversion permits, which is someone taking a piece of forest land that wants to, convert it to another use. They would come to the county and apply for a class 4 general, which goes through our type 2 land use review process, which involves SEPA and a notice sent out within 1,000 feet of everyone for comment.
Does that apply a different zoning then?
It does not.
Okay. We've been talking a lot about resource lands lately. Thanks.
Yeah, it applies anywhere within our urban and rural areas. And we have also certain class 1 applications and conversion option harvest plans, which is more of a robust application that can provide a landowner the ability to keep harvesting with a state DNR application and avoid a 6-year development moratorium. So with our map here, all the green trees, squares are forest practice moratoriums, which is a active state Department of Natural Resources logging permit that requires reforestation. And when it requires reforestation, that's when we have a 6-year development moratorium at the county.
There's a way to get around that?
Yeah, I'll talk about that
Okay,
here
good.
real quick. We have 2 ways to move through those. We have a single family dwelling waiver, which is for a property that doesn't have any existing residents that would take 2 acres and remove the reforestation requirement. But anything else outside of the 2 acres that was harvested would still have to be replanted back to what our county ordinance would recall would be 190 trees per acre in the upland areas. And then if any critical areas were harvested, we'd look at, talking with our habitat folks and seeing what the mitigation would be. Usually it's 300 trees per acre for Clark County is what we've been doing.
Just on that particular one, is there any enforcement on or going back and checking to see if they actually replanted?
So part of the waiver is creating a monitoring case. And so the waiver is good for 2 years. And then after 2 years, there's a 3-year monitoring period. And so all our waivers have recently with our new permitting program, they have an associated monitoring case. So going back and making sure that things are getting done is part of the process. And then the type 3 removal of the development moratorium, if you're doing something outside of a single family residence, that's going to go through the type 3 process with the hearing examiner. And there's some things to consider when we're looking at those reviews, if they've met all the conditions with the DNR permit as far as replanting, and if any critical areas were harvested, that they be mitigated and or have a plan as such. And then they could be, approved with conditions.
Are there fines if they don't replant? I just have a couple cases in mind of places I know.
There's not necessarily fines, but if a critical area was harvested, there could be looked at what the value was, and then the mitigation would be twice what the value of timber removed in that area was. And we've had that enforced on a last type 3 case. And then we also have our Department of Natural Resources folks. And so they're, dealing with applications that require replanting. And I'm dealing with cases that are not dealing with replanting, but, building a home or something else and such. Next slide, please. And lastly, I talk about our designated forest land program, and that's through the or designated forest lands. That's through our assessor's office. And primarily my role is to review the timber management plans that are come into that program and make sure that they meet the minimum requirements that we asked for, which are the Department of Revenue's minimum requirements for timber management plans. The optional stuff is, for someone to just go above and beyond, but not required at the county. And here's some minimum qualifications as far as, having 5 acres and primarily growing timber, and that you're within forest practice rule compliance. So if you want to live on that property, you need a 6-acre parcel or larger. And some people say, well, I have, streams of wetlands, I can't manage that full 5 acres. Well, that doesn't matter. Those rules that protect the streams and wetlands, even though you can't manage it, it's still considered forest land. And so it could still be part of the program. Yep. That's primarily all I have.
I have a question. How much harvest is actually going on from private forest lands? How much of a economic impact is that?
I don't think we have an answer to that. I mean, if you look at the slide that Hunter showed that had all the little green trees, that's a lot of DNR permits that are out there. There's a lot of moratoriums that we sort of keep an eye on, which means that there's quite a bit of forestry activity in Clark County that's happening. In addition to that, Hunter issues, 100 or so permits a year, and those are typically all conversions. So if somebody's harvesting 3, 4, 5 acres and then building a house and not replanting. So those are more like one-time inputs to forestry in the community.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thanks for this. I love how you manage our forests. That just beautiful to me. I wish the state would do something very similar, and that's kind of what our hopes were with the dabbler forest, that it would be thinned in a more appropriate way, the way that you do it. I'd love to go with you sometime to see how you do the skids or cables or whatever to get it thinned so appropriately without disturbing the other trees. I would love to nerd out on that. Like for it looks like most of the forested land in our county is state managed. And has there been ever any history of the county? I know it's mostly trust land, so it has to provide income and has to be harvested in a way that maximizes income for schools and other things. Has there been any history with trying to exchange lands with our county? I see there's none in the heavily forested areas. There's no county lands. It looks like Bonneville is the most forested piece that we manage. I was just curious what the history of that is.
Most of the conversations with the state about transferring property have been properties that are sort of segregated off from the larger chunks, because they're not as effectively managed when they're separated off from the bigger blocks of state forest land. So there haven't been a whole lot of conversations about other than that. There's a few properties near Camp Bonneville that we've talked about, and then a few others here and there around the county, but nothing bigger.
Oh, thank you. And then if it ever did happen, if it was trust land, it would have to be swapped out with something else, because they'd still have to manage a certain number of acres for a certain number of income under the trust, some kind of trust requirements.
Correct. And the couple examples that we've seen. So there's different types of trusts. There's the common school trust. There's one that's they call the county trust. The county trusts are eligible for reconveyance. I think Councilor Marshall, you were here when we talked about the Hantwick Trail property that was transferred to the county. That one was in common school, and they had to do interfund transfer, and then it could be reconveyed to the county. So depending on what trust it's in, there's different methods or approaches to how the property could be transferred to the county.
Okay. Well, thank you for what you do.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Could you go ahead, Councilor Young.
I've got a few questions, so if you have something quick, go ahead.
Well, I'll ask. I don't know how quick it'll be, but I was just, if you could just kind of summarize, I haven't looked at the forest plan, but what we're managing toward, are we looking at connectivity? What's our overall strategy related to will things ultimately become old growth? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we could address that. I mean, so I'd go back to when it sort of was envisioned, and that was Hunter's predecessor. Jim Vanling was the county forester here, and I think he was looking at some of the properties that we own, like Camp Bonneville and Green Mountain and Spud Mountain, had come on board, and thinking about, you know, that sort of the approach in the Pacific Northwest has been what we call even age management, right? It's like crop management. You have a piece of ground, you plant trees, they're all the same species, they grow at all the same rate, they get to 30 or 40 years old, you cut them down, you do it again, right? And even when I was in school at Oregon State, that was still kind of the approach, but we were talking about sustained yield, which is kind of what the state's doing, where you have smaller blocks and you know that you can kind of work through those over time, cut and plant, cut and plant, and kind of, but you're always going to have a sustained yield coming in that the state can depend on, which they need to, right? And so Jim's vision was to look at a different way, which is like sort of that same rotational harvesting, but in a thinning approach, so that you're never having huge, large areas that are necessarily clear cut, but you're always able to still manage a sustained yield from that property, but still have like intact forest for the community, for fish and wildlife, et cetera. So I think that's the approach. We're managing towards later cereal, more mature forests, not necessarily old growth, because I think you're going to still work your way through and cut trees perpetually, if that makes sense.
If you didn't want to manage for old growth,
If-
if that makes sense.
Yeah, if you want to manage for old growth, that's a different, I mean, that's a different approach as well.
Was it thought that just having some source of revenue would be good to sort of make the program sustainable?
Yes.
Okay.
And the idea behind Camp Bonneville specifically is that forest management helps maintain the property, provide that maintenance. It's built into some of the transfer documents and the reuse plan and things of that nature.
Right. I hate to rule out old growth as a goal. And is connectivity, looking at kind of piecing in terms of prioritizing, if we were to look at additional forest property for this program, would that connectivity, wildlife corridors, that sort of thing be part of?
I think the connectivity and wildlife corridors, it fits more in the natural areas acquisition plan and the high value conservation lands in the county. And then the sustainable forest management is like how we manage each individual forested property.
Got it.
And to address the old growth, Hunter and I have been talking a lot lately about the legacy forests, because I know that's been, call them legacy forests, call them mature forests, these sort of pockets of forest that didn't, like we have some at Camp Bonneville that didn't burn, with the Yakult burn 120 years ago, whenever that was, right? And so like those are some segments of the camp that we've talked about. We should probably identify those in the plan and protect those. And, there could be some components of the property that are going to be old growth. Riparian sections will be old growth because we're not going to harvest in riparian sections. That's just, we banned those out when we lay out units. So I think there's some opportunity there.
I think connecting it with a wildlife goal would be a great thing. Okay, Councilor Young, sorry, that might have taken a little longer.
No problem. Thank you. The first question that I have is, does the technology exist to, to essentially have the canopy monitored? So, to look for like illegal harvesting or, that type of nature, unpermitted clearing, anything like that. Does that exist at all that you're aware of?
I mean, we use aerial photography, I think would be our best image of what's, gone on prior to. And
But it takes human eyes to look at, 2019 pictures and 2024 pictures and compare. There's nothing that kind of just does that autonomously.
yeah, we don't have anything automated that would do that.
Okay.
Like right now, when a DNR application gets approved at the state level, I get an email that, every so often that says, these ones have been approved. And I go into a GIS system and tag those for the development moratorium, which then has like a week turnaround to go on to Maps Online for, for everyone to see. With DNR applications, I forgot to mention that I don't review them. So like the Dabbler timber sale and such, it's not part of my review process. So.
Okay, great. So a couple more questions. The next one would be, you quoted code and state law and everything like that, but can you just, for the public's sake, give a really quick answer as to, I would just give two examples. So, property that's inside the urban growth area and like a rural 5-acre parcel, somebody owns a home on it and there's some mature Doug fir. When are people required to have a permit in order to cut any of the trees down?
So within the urban growth area, if you have forests, a grouping of trees 2 acres or larger, that we would consider that forest land. And if you want to, cut it down and convert it to another use, we'd ask for a class 4 general. If you have some hazard trees or some individual trees, less than 2 acres, less than a log truck and a half worth of wood, which is about 5,000 board feet, and you're outside of any critical areas, you can harvest those trees. It'd be considered landscaping. You wouldn't need a permit per se. You may, if it's over 5,000 board feet, you may just have to register with the Department of Revenue. We are doing some code amendments that'll focus on some hazard tree applications to, look at those to be approved. But outside of rural Clark County or outside of the urban growth area, anything that's considered forest land that we're converting to another use would require a permit. Any hazard tree removals that are, not near structures, we would fall under a class 1 application and we would require a permit for those.
Okay, so if you just want to cut a tree down, if you've got 5 acres, you just want to cut a random tree down, you need a permit to do so.
If you have 5 acres and you're out in rural Clark County, you do have the right to harvest up to 5,000 board feet for personal use, which is about a log truck and a half worth of wood. So as long as it's outside of any critical areas,
Okay.
or buffers,
And
and
then,
that's for personal use.
okay, and then in the urban growth areas, so, let's say there's a, kind of an older farmhouse with 2 acres or something like that, but it's zoned to where you can have much smaller parcels. Can they just go and clear that entire site because it's less than a 2-acre total forest area?
Yeah, so if it's less than the 2 acres, they can clear that whole area without a class 4 general. If it's over the 5,000 board feet threshold, then we would ask for that class 1 application. But if it's less than 5,000 board feet, we wouldn't ask for anything.
Okay. One thing that I would encourage is, working with the jurisdiction for whose, growth area it is and seeing if we can make alignment of code. Because I know like the city of Vancouver, for example, they have their own urban plan for trees. And I know that at least it's probably changed since then, but I know at one point in time, if you have a lot that could be subdivided, that you cannot cut any tree down without a permit because they, they just want to be able to control when development is taking place and they don't want people to clear cut it before they divide, you know? So things like that, I just would encourage that communication to see if we can somewhat align our policies with the cities. And then thank you for answering that. The last question that I would have, and it was, you know, I absolutely appreciate this presentation. It's been very, very eye-opening and enlightening for me, and I'm grateful to hear this because I agree with Councillor Little. I think that we are really doing a, you know, an exceptional way of governing our forests here. The question I am curious about, and I'm not able to really see from the charts and the graphs that you did, was like, you know, you did good job of showing some before and afters, but how much of the befores do we have left? I mean, do we have a specific time frame where we're going to get all of this caught up and then we're not really going to have any thinning left to do at that point? Or are we taking it from the standpoint that we want to just kind of keep cycling, like, you know, to where by the time we get to the end, there's some undergrowth and stuff that we want to address now in the areas that we've already addressed? How, I mean, do you need more people to get all of our lands up to speed? I'm just looking for, you know, overall policy standpoint, where are we in a good place, or do any changes need to be made?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if we look at the Sustainable Forest Management Plan and what Hunter has been accomplishing, I think we were behind in terms of the objectives that we had initially laid out in the plan. So the priority units, the units that we wanted to thin the most, that would needed it the most, I don't think we've made it through all of those at even Camp Bonneville. And so, you know, we're starting on Spud Mountain because that's one that needs some work, and we've done a little bit of work at Green Mountain, but the other properties haven't been touched in a while. And you know, the question about do we need help, and I think the answer is yes. However, we've also tried to manage the program to stay under a threshold for small forest land management, which limits us to a cut of 2 million board feet on average annually. If you go above that, there's more reporting requirements with the state, and just a lot more staffing requirements. So with what we have, I think we're in pretty good shape, but it's something that if we look at adding more properties to the program and doing more, then we would need more staff to make that happen. So,
Okay, and can the revenue from the timber sales actually pay for that staff?
yes, that's how we would make it work, I think, is and there's enough property that we could look at. There are properties we've talked about in legacy lands and in parks that would make potentially good additions to the program in the future.
Okay. Yeah, look forward to hearing a little bit more about that. You know, I'm always open to, I want every department to let us know what their needs are. And it's nice when you're in a situation where there is a revenue source that you can tap to pay for the needed increases in staff and such. But thank you for answering those questions and for a good presentation.
You're welcome.
Councillor Little.
Thanks. I just want to follow up on the chair's question about older growth forests and goals. And it sounds like you have some goals on that that are really good. And I know that sustainable forestry, there's an income, a revenue generating goal along with habitat and a good canopy and diverse forests and all that. But it sounds like mostly it's overall for it to continually be harvested at some level. There's some kind of a harvest time that I'm not sure of, but I would encourage you. I'd love to talk more one-on-one on your goals that you had alluded to before on certain areas, having older growth goals. Maybe when you hit a certain DBH or diameter, that you would have more of a, like what's called late successional reserve with the federal forest goal, where once you see those parts of the forest under the legacy area that hit some goals on age, that at some point it would be a lighter touch until it does hit that older that old growth goal, which then there wouldn't actually be harvest in that certain area because it would have a healthy canopy and understory and all that stuff. And that would mean less income revenue coming in from those sales. And I understand that, but I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about what those goals could be. And if you need support from us to do that, let us know too. But sounds like you're on the right track.
No, thank you. Those are really great comments. And I just want to go back to what Hunter mentioned about the plan. We do need to go work through a process to update it in 2027 because it's been 10 years. And that'll run through the certification process again with the Forest Stewardship Council and American Tree Farmers. And I think that's a great time to work with council on some priorities and goals in that plan.
Yeah, like even for instance, at Spud Mountain, there's a area in the very northeast corner that I would say could qualify as legacy forests, but we're not touching it. It's across the stream. And it's not even a big enough area like to do any kind of management. It doesn't make sense. It makes sense to just look at it and acknowledge it. But you know, that would be something that we'd say in the update. That's not currently right now.
And I just add potential recreational uses would be something to have on the radar as well. So Councillor Little and I will be meeting with Commissioner Upthegrove tomorrow for a brief meeting. And I think at some point the full council will have a chance to interact with him. But I'm really curious about the state-owned land, both for potential to meet any of our goals related to forestry, and then the natural areas as well, because I'm aware the city of Battleground, there's some DNR that's abuts the city
Yes.
boundary, and it's one of the site-specific requests to come into the growth boundary. And the city of Battleground is interested in that, not for development, but to have it as a park. So it just made me think there could be other opportunities out there to look at the DNR lands and how we could collaborate with them to meet some of our goals. And I know Chair Medvedji and I met with DNR and looked at the Dabbler property and thought about it if there was any reconveyance opportunity there, but it just didn't seem to pan out. And it was too far down the line in terms of timber sale and all of that. But I'd like to be able to look at that. I think there could be opportunities. Okay, any other, or if you have any questions you want to ask, for us to ask up the Grove, just let us know.
Okay.
Okay, I don't think there's any other questions, so thank you very much. Oh, and I just would add, because I think a lot of this habitat, we're going to be adopting a resolution on Bigfoot, so, you know, there's a nexus there.
All right.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. This was great. Okay, I think we're all done with our work sessions, and we can have a nice lunch break and reconvene at 1 o'clock. Thank you.